I am Suresh Babu, Senior Research Fellow and Head of Capacity Strengthening at IFPRI. First of all, I would like to thank Stephen Vare Omomo and his team in WFP for putting together an excellent report on the current status of food assistance that is going to developing countries and also the countries in food crisis. I classify my comments in three broad categories. We'll talk broadly about the issues that the report brings out in the context of food assistance and in the context of current famine and crisis that are going on. And then we'll talk about how to go from crisis to resilience and what are the issues that the report covers and what are some of the gaps that it leaves behind. And we'll also talk about the national capacities that have to be in place in order to continuously fight the crisis that the countries are facing. To start with, humanitarian crisis, the report nicely brings out a framework to classify the countries, and that's a very useful way of putting countries in a typology where we can study what are the causes and the constraints that the countries are facing in order to respond to the humanitarian crisis. But what may be useful in that context is to think about what are the political economy issues that are involved in humanitarian crisis. Not necessarily the conflict-oriented issues, but going beyond that to see even in countries where food security is there in normal years, but then in certain years they get into food insecurity. And these are the countries are also needing help in terms of humanitarian response. And how can we help those countries as well, in addition to the countries that are in deep crisis because of the conflict? So the political economy issues come from who raises the issue of a disaster. Does it come from politicians? Does it come from the government in order to show that they are not waiting for a crisis to happen and they are acting in time? Or is it driven by the national actors and players in the policy system? And that needs to be fully understood. And also the second issue in terms of going from chronic food insecurity to acute food insecurity situation, which warrants humanitarian response, is how do we assess the needs of how many people are in difficulty? And that again continues to be a challenge, and the report talks a little bit about it, but it can probably expand on those issues, particularly how do we measure who is in food insecure situation and both in chronic food insecure as well as acute food insecurity. The current methodologies that we are using to assess and that actually WFP uses also in terms of the number of people who are affected leaves a lot of room for people to kind of manipulate the data according to their own needs. And politicians can actually use that for that purpose. But the question is, how do we as development community, in particular WFP, assess that independently rather than taking the number of people affected that is given by the government? Another related issue that the report raises is the cost effectiveness of humanitarian response. And it is something that requires data at the country level and the national systems to collect the data on what it costs to bring in food or cash, and which is the best way to provide the assistance. And that requires market analysis. Data for market analysis of the commodities that are used in the countries are weak. National systems are weak. At the same time, drought is or the humanitarian crisis is seen as an opportunity to make business for a lot of entities in the countries. And the report talks very little about it, and that brings us to talk about the model, the business model of WFP itself. How do we enter a country, how do we help the country, and how do you leave the country after solving the problem? The second issue is going from broad humanitarian crisis that happens either due to climate change or due to conflict, but seem to be a lot of countries are in that kind of mode, few years of good normal rainfall, and then they go back to crisis mode because of the droughts. How do we go from humanitarian response to resilience? How do we build that capacity at the national level? And although the report talks about building national capacity, there are a lot more than just training people for calculating number of people affected and planning humanitarian response. The institutions have to be built and the policy systems have to be built, and the report could be probably better in highlighting those things. But overall, the report does an excellent job of bringing together the current state of food assistance, and we have a good picture of what is happening on the ground and what we need to do as we go from crisis to resilience. Thank you.